My son-in-law had two hotel security guards walk me out of my daughter's birthday dinner because he said I was making his clients uncomfortable. He stood near the bar holding a glass of something that cost more than my electric bill and watched me leave without a single word. That was a Saturday night in March. The following Tuesday evening, I was sitting in my recliner in Hendricks, Indiana, when the 6 o'clock news broke the story of his federal arrest. They showed footage from outside the Meridian Grand Hotel on North Illinois Street in Indianapolis. I recognized the lobby. I had walked through it 4 days earlier, with a security guard at each elbow. I turned up the volume and finished my coffee. You're watching Father's Revenge Stories, and I'm glad you chose to spend your time here. Before we begin, drop a comment telling me your city or state. I'd love to know where this story finds you, and please know this story includes some fictional details added for storytelling purposes. But the lesson at the end is one I lived, and it's real. My name is Arlo Sims. I am 64 years old, and I live alone in a 3-bedroom ranch house on Clover Mills Road in Hendricks, Indiana, which is the kind of small town where the diner still has a hand-painted menu board, and the county seat is 20 minutes away, and people wave at each other on 2-lane roads out of habit rather than intention. The house has been in my family since 1978. My father bought it, my mother planted the garden along the back fence, and when they passed it came to me. I repainted it twice, replaced the roof in 2011, installed a new HVAC system the same year because I had spent 31 years in the heating and cooling business, and I knew exactly what a 20-year-old neglected unit sounded like when it was about to give out. I sold Sims Heating and Cooling 5 years ago to a young man named Perry who had good instincts and steadier knees than mine. I retired the way a man who has spent his working life doing physical work retires, which is to say I still fix things constantly just for myself now, for neighbors, for people from church who called and said they had a problem and didn't know who else to ask. That kind of retirement suits me. It always has had. My wife Jean passed away 2 years and 3 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless the way that disease tends to be. She was diagnosed in September and gone by February, and I have spent the time since learning how to inhabit a house that was built around 2 people when only one remains. That is its own kind of work, and you do not retire from it. My daughter Audra was 27 when her mother died. She had been married to my son-in-law Brandon Alcott for about a year at that point. They had met at a networking event in Indianapolis. She was doing marketing for a healthcare company. He was doing commercial real estate development, and doing it loudly, which was the only way Brandon Alcott had ever done anything in the 4 years I had known him. He wore suits too well fitted for a man who wanted you to think he was casual. He talked about investment returns, the way other men talked about sports. He asked me about my retirement accounts at my daughter's kitchen table 6 weeks after I first met him, framing it as friendly curiosity, and I answered vaguely and changed the subject and filed the moment away in the back of my mind where I kept things that didn't quite add up but that I wasn't ready to address. Audra loved him. That was the part I kept returning to. She was not a foolish woman. She had her mother's instincts and her mother's directness, and I had not in 31 years of raising her ever watched her be genuinely deceived. But love has its own logic, and the smartest person in a room can still miss what they don't want to find. After Jean died, I saw Audra maybe 6 times over the following year, not because she didn't care. The phone calls were good, warm, the kind where you end up talking for an hour about nothing in particular and hang up feeling like you've sat across from someone rather than talked into a device. But the visits were Brandon's territory. He didn't manage me clumsily. A clumsy man would have made obvious excuses, and you would have known immediately where you stood. Brandon was not clumsy. He was the kind of man who had built his entire career on making people feel comfortable while he moved them into exactly the position he needed them in. When Audra suggested I come for Thanksgiving, he would say, of course, and then a few days before, something would come up. A client commitment, a scheduling conflict, just bad timing, Arlo. We'll make it up soon. I was never angry about it. I was watching, which is different. My neighbor Myrna Hicks had been watching alongside me since the beginning. Myrna was 68, a widow of 7 years, and she had lived next door since before Audra was born. She had been one of Jean's closest friends, and she had continued showing up for me after the funeral with the faithful persistence of a woman who had decided that grief did not get to take 2 people from a household if she could help it. She brought casseroles when I forgot to cook, and asked direct questions when I gave her indirect answers, and sat on the porch with me in the evenings when the house got too quiet. She was one of a very small number of people in my life about whom I had never once had to wonder. The first real alarm was the folder. In January, Audra had invited me up to Indianapolis for the weekend, a genuine visit, and I had made the drive and found the house warm and dinner on the table, and my daughter glad to see me in the uncomplicated way that reminded me of when she was 12. It was a good evening. We talked about her mother, looked at photographs, stayed up past 10, which was later than either of us usually managed. Brandon had been present, but quieter than usual, which I noted and did not analyze. The next morning over coffee, he came to the table with a manila folder. He set it down the way a man sets something down when he has rehearsed the gesture. Casual, but not quite. He said, "Arlo, I've been wanting to talk to you about this for a while. With the economy, and with you being on your own now, Audra and I have been thinking about how to make sure you're taken care of, just in case anything ever comes up." He opened the folder, several pages, dense print, a signature line at the bottom. "It's a power of attorney," he said, with exactly the ease of someone who has practiced saying those 4 words until they sound like nothing. Completely standard. It just means if you were ever sick or in an emergency, I'd be authorized to handle things on your behalf. Bills, the bank, any property decisions that come up quickly. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing. He slid it across the table at a very deliberate angle. I looked at the document. I looked at my son-in-law's face, open, concerned, the picture of a devoted husband protecting his father-in-law. I told him I would take it home and read it carefully before signing anything. He said, "Of course, take all the time you need," and smiled with the warmth of a man who had already calculated the only possible outcome. Myrna was on the porch when I got home. She read something in my face before I reached the steps. "He wants me to sign a power of attorney," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you going to?" "No," I said. "Good," she said. That was the whole conversation. The following week, I called Russell Tate, a semi-retired estate attorney in Columbus, Indiana, who I had known since we played on the same church softball league in our 30s, and who had drafted Jean's and my wills back when we were still young enough to believe we had unlimited time to get around to it. I trusted him the way you trust someone who has never given you a reason not to. I drove to his office on a Wednesday morning and told him everything: the folder, the dinner, Brandon's question about my retirement accounts in year 1 of the marriage, the gradual contraction of visits. Russell listened with the stillness of a man who had heard 30 years' worth of family financial schemes and had long since stopped being surprised by their basic shape. When I finished, he set his pen down and looked at me. "Arlo," he said, "tell me what you think your estate amounts to." I told him. The house and the 40 acres that came from my parents, appraised recently at considerably more than I had expected because of what farmland in this part of Indiana had done over the past decade. The retirement accounts from 30 years of running the business. Jean's small brokerage account that I had not touched since she died, the savings. Russell nodded slowly. "Brandon knows the specifics?" "He knows about the house. He asked about retirement accounts once, and I was vague. I don't believe he knows the current appraisal on the land." Russell nodded again, the nod of a man confirming a suspicion. "A power of attorney in Indiana," he said, "if properly executed, gives the holder authority to conduct real property transactions, liquidate investment accounts, and manage banking on your behalf. If Brandon had your signature on that document, he would have had the legal ability to sell your parents' land, access your retirement funds, and transfer assets without your involvement or approval, legally and completely." The words landed the way plain things land, when you've been circling around them in your mind for weeks, and suddenly someone just says them out loud. "We are going to update your will today," Russell said. "We are going to establish a revocable living trust that shelters your primary assets in a structure he cannot access without a court order, and we are going to document everything you've told me with a signed and dated record in my files." I spent 3 hours in Russell's office. When I left, I had a new will, a trust that moved my property and accounts behind a legal wall, and the clean, specific clarity that comes from having done what needed doing before it became urgent. I stopped at the Dairy Queen on State Road 46 on the way home and ate a chocolate-dipped cone in the parking lot. Jean would have found that extremely satisfying. The birthday dinner was Audra's idea. She called in late February and said she wanted to do something for her 32nd birthday, a dinner at the Meridian Grand. Some of Brandon's business contacts would be there, but mostly people she cared about, and she wanted me there. I said yes without hesitation. What happened between that phone call and the Saturday in March was something I didn't fully understand until Audra told me herself later. Brandon had, across several evenings and several carefully managed conversations, gently raised concerns about the guest dynamics. Not that he didn't want me there. Of course he wanted me there. But the investor relationships, the professional context. There was something about the optics. He loved Arlo, but maybe Arlo would be more comfortable seated with the older relatives rather than at the main table. I drove 90 miles without knowing any of that. I arrived at 7 in a blue sport coat I had bought for Jean's company Christmas party 11 years ago and which still fit because 30 years in crawl spaces and mechanical rooms will keep a man honest. The lobby was marble and brass, and the kind of low lighting that makes everyone look like they can afford to be there. A young woman at the event's desk led me down a corridor toward the private ballroom. Brandon was near the entrance. He saw me cross the room, and something moved across his face very quickly. Not surprise, something more deliberate than surprise. He shook my hand, said, "Arlo, glad you made it." The way you say it to someone whose attendance was never really the point. I found Audra across the room. She hugged me longer than usual, didn't say anything, just held on. I had been seated perhaps 40 minutes, and I had found the older relatives, and we were talking about things that actually interested us, when Brandon appeared at my elbow with two men I didn't know. He introduced me as Audra's father, with an inflection that meant, and that is the full extent of his relevance. 20 minutes after that, two hotel security staff approached my table. Young men, professional, apologetic. They said they had been asked to let me know that my presence was creating some concerns for the host, and if I would be comfortable, they could arrange a car. I understood immediately. I did not make a scene. That was a choice, not a failure of nerve. I folded my napkin and set it on the table and said a quiet goodbye to the people beside me, most of whom looked genuinely uncomfortable on my behalf. I walked toward the exit. Brandon was near the bar, champagne in hand, watching, and the expression on his face was the one I had been trying to name for 4 years. It was the look of a man who had just confirmed what he had always believed, which was that I would not fight back, that I would take whatever was handed to me and drive home quietly. I nodded once at him. I walked out through the marble lobby and into the cold March air on North Illinois Street. I drove home 90 miles with the radio off. Not because I was devastated, though there was grief in it, the quiet grief of a man who has finally stopped being surprised by something he watched coming for a long time, but because I needed to think, and I think best in silence. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment below with 999 or still here so I know you're along for the rest of this. And fair warning, the events that follow include some dramatic elements added for the telling, but the truth, at the center of all of it, is exactly true. By the time I pulled into Clover Mills Road, I had made two decisions. The first was that I was finished being managed. The second was that I didn't need to do anything about it. A structure built on dishonesty requires constant maintenance. You have to keep telling the same lies, keep controlling the same variables, and variables have a way of exceeding the control of the people trying to manage them. I had spent 31 years working with systems complex enough to fail in ways their designers never anticipated. I understood this principle well. Myrna came the next morning with biscuits and a look that said she already knew something had gone wrong. I told her everything over coffee. She was quiet for a long time after. Then she said, "He had hotel security walk you out in front of your daughter's guests." "Yes," I said. She said, "He is a very small man, Arlo." "I know," I said. She put her hand over mine on the table. "Your Jean would have been 20 minutes ahead of all of this," she said. "At least 20, I said. Myrna laughed. "Short and warm, the kind that belongs in kitchens on slow mornings," she said. "She always was. That's why she kept you from getting lost." I let myself have that for a moment. Then I ate a biscuit. It helped considerably. I did not reach out to Audra after the dinner, and Audra did not reach out to me. That silence lasted 10 days. I understood it without needing to analyze it. She was inside something she couldn't fully see yet, and the last thing she needed was her father applying pressure from one direction while her husband applied it from another. So I waited, and I let the waiting be what it was. On the 11th day, the 6 o'clock news. I had the television on in the background while I was reading when the anchor's tone shifted into the register. That means the story is real, and the desk has cleared everything else to make room for it. I looked up. The headline read, "Indianapolis developer arrested in federal wire fraud investigation." I set my book down on my knee. The story came out in pieces over the following hour, then more fully over the following days, as reporters dug in, and sources came forward, and the shape of everything clarified. Brandon Alcott and a business partner had been operating a private real estate investment fund. The properties existed. The financial reports sent to investors did not. Money had been moved, returns had been fabricated, and a significant portion of investor funds had been used for personal expenses, including, as it later came out, the Meridian Grand Birthday Dinner. Federal investigators had arrived at the hotel that Tuesday evening during a separate event. Brandon had been detained in the lobby. My phone rang at 9:17. Audra's voice was the voice of someone who has been crying for hours and has gone past the raw stage into the flat, exhausted aftermath. Dad, she said. Dad, I need to tell you something. I'm listening, sweetheart. She told me about the work phone. Brandon's second phone, the one he kept in the home office and that she had never had reason to look at. She had found it on the kitchen counter, 2 days after the birthday dinner, picked it up without thinking, and the screen had already been unlocked. She had seen an email thread before she put it down. She read parts of it to me from memory, Brandon writing to his business partner about my property, describing the land and the house with figures that told me he had obtained a copy of the appraisal. Writing, the POA is the fastest route. Once I have authorization to act on his behalf, I can execute the land transfer within 60 days. He won't question it because he trusts Audra and Audra trusts me. By the time he understands what's happened, the transaction will be recorded. His partner writing back, asking about my mental sharpness. Brandon writing, sharp enough to be annoying, but not sharp enough to understand what he doesn't know about estate law. He ran an HVAC company for 30 years. He thinks a basic will is enough protection. It isn't. Audra stopped reading at that line. A silence came over the phone that was not empty, it was full. Dad, she said, did you know? I looked at the photograph of Jean on the bookshelf, the one from the summer we drove to the Smoky Mountains. She was wearing a yellow jacket, and she looked so completely herself that it still stopped me for half a second every time I glanced at it. I knew something, I said. I wasn't certain until tonight. Why didn't you tell me? I thought about that carefully before answering it. Because I couldn't tell you, I said, without asking you to choose between what you wanted to believe about him and what the evidence was pointing toward. That's not a choice a father makes for his daughter. It's one she has to come to herself. Audra didn't answer for a long time. When she did, her voice had gone quiet in a way that meant she had reached something underneath everything else. I should have asked to meet you before the wedding, she said. I should have paid more attention to the things that didn't fit. I kept explaining them away. You were in love, I said. That's not an excuse. No, I said, but it's a reason, and reasons aren't excuses, they're just reasons. She started crying again, a fresher kind than before. Mom would have seen it, she said. Probably, I said. Your mother had a way of seeing things I hadn't noticed and presenting them in such a way that you thought you'd figured it out yourself. It was her most impressive skill by a considerable margin. Audra laughed through the tears, one short surprised sound. I held on to it. I need to come home, she said. Can I come home? Clover Mills Road hasn't moved, I said. She came on a Thursday. She pulled into the driveway at noon, and when she got out of the blue Subaru, she looked like a person who had set down something extremely heavy and was still feeling the unfamiliar absence of the weight. Myrna appeared at the fence within 4 minutes. I still don't know how she knew. She went back inside and returned with a plate of oatmeal cookies and a pot of coffee and set them on the porch railing and said, I'll leave you two alone, and went home without being asked. She was that kind of neighbor. Audra and I sat on the porch for 2 hours. She told me about the confrontation at the house 2 nights after the arrest. Brandon had come home on bail, and she had shown him the emails, and he had not denied them. He had tried to explain them, which is its own kind of confession. He had talked about market pressures and timing and financial obligations, and none of it had been the thing she was actually waiting for, which was an apology that sounded like understanding rather than regret at being caught. She had asked him to leave. He had. I went inside and brought out the folder Russell had given me 3 months earlier. The trust documents, the updated will. I set it on the railing beside the cookies and told her what it contained. She read through it quietly. When she reached the beneficiary section, she stopped. Half of it's already yours, I said. It's always been yours. I just made it formal and protected. She held the papers in her lap for a long moment. The afternoon light was doing what October light does in Indiana, coming in low and touching everything with that specific gold that lasts maybe 40 minutes before the angle shifts and it's gone. Jean used to stand at the kitchen window in October just to watch it. I miss Mom, Audra said. Me too, sweetheart. She looked at the cookie plate. Mom would have made something better than these, she said. She would have made everything better, I said. That was one of her primary functions. Audra smiled. Then she leaned back in the porch chair the way a person does when they have finally decided to stop bracing for something. Russell called the following week to say that Brandon's attorney had reached out to his office, had been informed of the trust structure, and would not be pursuing anything further regarding my estate. I thanked him and asked about his knee. He said still lousy. I said I knew a man who could look at his ductwork if he needed a favor. He laughed. We had lunch the following Thursday. Brandon Alcott pleaded guilty to 2 counts of wire fraud 8 months after his arrest. His business partner received a separate sentence. The Meridian Grand Hotel sent me a formal written apology for the March incident, which I read once, set on the counter, and eventually used as a bookmark in the novel I was reading that winter. Audra moved back to Hendricks for a few months while she sorted through the next steps. She found an apartment in Columbus the following spring, close enough to drive out on Sundays. She was here last weekend. She brought wine and I made beef stew from the recipe Jean had written on a note card in 1989 that is still held to the refrigerator with a Gatlinburg magnet. After dinner, we sat at the kitchen table, the way you sit when the food is done and the conversation is still going, and neither person's in any particular hurry. We talked about her mother. We talked about what came next for Audra, professionally and otherwise. We talked about the 40 acres. You know you never have to give any of it away, she said. It can just stay yours. I know, I said, but there's something settled about knowing where it goes. She looked at the note card on the refrigerator for a moment. Dad, she said, I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I've thought about that, I said. And the honest answer is that you saw exactly as much as someone who loved that man was going to see, until you were ready to look at the rest of it. I can't hold that against you. She nodded. You were patient with me, she said. I was patient with myself too, I said. Longer than I should have been. I kept waiting for him to turn out to be something other than what he was. Kept thinking that if I stayed quiet and stayed available, things would correct themselves on their own. She said, and they did, eventually. Not on their own, I said. I just had to stop protecting him from the consequences of being exactly who he was. There's a difference between patience and avoidance. I confused them for a long time. She drove back to Columbus at 8. I watched her taillights down Clover Mills Road until they turned at the corner and disappeared. Myrna's porch light was on next door. I stood in the driveway for a few minutes in the October air, which had gone genuinely cold now, the kind that means the season has committed. Then I went inside and did the dishes and put the kettle on. I sat in my chair in the quiet house and let it be quiet, not empty, just mine. Here is what I want to say to you before you go, and I want to say it plainly because I have earned the right to be plain about it. For most of the years I am describing, I believed that staying quiet was the same as being patient. I believed that absorbing what was handed to me without responding was a form of grace. I was wrong about that. Silence that comes from wisdom looks the same from the outside as silence that comes from fear. But you know the difference on the inside. I knew the difference. I just wasn't ready to act on it. If you are in the middle of something that resembles what I have described, do not wait for the situation to correct itself. Protect yourself now, while you still have every option available. Talk to an estate attorney about what a power of attorney actually authorizes. Understand what a revocable living trust does and doesn't protect. Ask the questions that feel uncomfortable to ask, because they are considerably less uncomfortable than asking them too late. And if someone in your life is quietly editing you out of the story they are building, let me tell you what I have come to understand. That is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of their calculation, and calculations have a way of proving themselves wrong in the most public possible circumstances. Jean used to say the truth moves slow, but it always gets there. She was right about most things. She was right about that one too. If this story found you at the right time, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next one. And leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Thank you for staying until the end.